I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Tim Bray. Tim Bray is a 40-year veteran of the world of high tech. Tim is a Canadian who grew up in Lebanon and has lived in Vancouver since the 80s. He has worked for 2 computer companies, 2 of his own startups, Google, and most recently, Amazon, which he left on May 1st, 2020, in protest over the company's firing of activists who were organizing support for warehouse workers who were at risk for COVID-19. He is the editor of several internet standards and the holder of multiple patents. Tim is active on social media at Tim Bray on Twitter, at TIMBRAY, and with a blog at tbray.org, TBRAY.org. He is also an environmental activist focusing on climate emergency issues. And in 2018, Tim was an arrestee at a popular protest against a heavy oil pipeline. Tim, we're really delighted to have you with us this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for speaking out. Thank you for what you are doing. Tim.
Well, and thank you so much for having me. Can people hear me? Shout, wave if you can't.
Yes.
I hear some nods. Okay, great. Thank you. So, you know, when I quit Amazon, I felt kind of lonely. And it's really excellent to feel part of something larger. So sincerely, thank you so much for having me here today. Now, obviously, the reason I'm here is that, as Stuart said, on May 1st, I walked away from a high-paid, VP-ranked job as a member of the leadership of Amazon Web Services, and became briefly infamous for resigning on principle because Amazon had adopted a policy of firing activists who spoke up about the warehouse workers' fears and struggles in the face of COVID-19. It was a hard choice because it was a good job, but I have no regrets. So most of you have probably heard the stories about the struggles and really awful things that are going on in some of the Amazon warehouses. So let me tell you a couple of other stories about working at Amazon that I think make an important point. So the first one happened last fall in October or November. At Amazon, I was a distinguished engineer, which is to say a leading technologist. One important part of my job was mentoring younger engineers, in particular, those we'd identified as having the potential to join the ranks of leaders. So there was this one young engineer who gave all the signs of being a budding superstar, a woman of color, by the way, and I'd been mentoring her, and I knew her pretty well. Let's call her Louise. One time, she canceled our scheduled talk because she was sick at home. But the next day, I saw her on her team's chat channel saying she had something on her screen she wanted somebody to walk over to her desk and look at. So I chatted at her, "Hey, Louise, glad to see you've recovered." And she chatted back, "No, I'm still feeling awful, but the team is way behind on fixing this big customer problem, so I came in to help." So I chatted right back at her saying, "Look, you're doing this wrong. Put your coat on and go home. How about right now?" She came back and said, "Oh, first my manager yelled at me and then the team GM and now you. Okay, all right, I'll go." And that was the right thing to do. First of all, she was a valued employee and we wanted to make sure she felt that way. Second, flu season was coming, and a lot of our engineers were clueless young men who think they're immune to the laws of physics, so why would they get flu shots? All we needed was to get a dose of flu going around our engineering group. So let me tell you another story. This is from March this year, which is like 200 years ago. Well, actually only 3 months, but it sure feels that way. So the NBA canceled its season on Thursday, March 12th. The next week, the entire big tech industry sent its workers home. No planning, no counting the cost, just send them all home to work from home. Starting right then, at every VP level leadership meeting, the meeting opened with a discussion of, well, how's work from home going? We talked about who might be having problems, how managers should do their jobs when they couldn't walk over to an employee's desk, what the HR people should do to stay on top of who might be hurting. We encouraged managers to over-communicate, to make sure they had a one-to-one conversation with everyone at least once a week. We leaned on senior managers to have regular talks with the individual engineers just to make sure they were doing okay in work from home mode. There was a flurry of discussion about what employees should do if they needed a big screen or a better chair or something like that. And the VP I reported to short-circuited it and said, well, they should just come into the office and grab something and take it home. We don't need to talk about that. And here's something interesting. We told the managers, you're not going to spot the problems people might be having. We need you to encourage them to speak up and proactively tell us what we're doing wrong. So do you spot a pattern here? In the world of tech, there is a certain class of worker who gets treated just fine. The leadership bends over backwards to treat them right and to keep them happy and to keep them healthy. Then there's the warehouse workers. The stories we hear about the company refusing to share information about who's sick and who's not, about social distancing, except at shift peak when those trucks have to be loaded, about officially just shipping essentials, but we still hear stories about people moving pallets of iPhone cases and Pepsi products, and especially more than anything else, about how the people who speak up get fired. As Christy Hoffman pointed out, there have been wins. People push back and win sometimes. A bit more about that in a minute. I almost feel like I'm wasting your time by talking about the difference between these two scenarios, but it's so obvious because it's so obvious, but let's do it anyhow. It's all about power. The engineering workers are high paid and in demand, and if they're not happy with their work at Amazon, they're going to go get a job at Microsoft or Facebook or some hot new startup. They have power, so they get good treatment. And in the warehouse, the workers have no power, and so they get a very different kind of treatment. They're in what you might want to call a different class, but that word is unfashionable in 2020. So I think we can all agree that a world in which the warehouse workers have more power is what we'd like to see. So how do we get there? So what are the potential sources of worker power? First, there's the power they get legally from legal and legislative and regulatory frameworks. Then there's the power they take for themselves by organizing in collective action. So there are grounds for hope. I was talking to some of the Amazon warehouse activists who successfully organized wildcat one-shift strikes right down on the spot along the lines of tell us who's sick with COVID or we're not coming to work. And it worked. Amazon became much more transparent. And as Christy just pointed out, there were big victories in France and various places around the world where the workers got together and organized. Now, unfortunately, Amazon is an American corporation. And America is an environment that is uniquely union hostile. When you try to organize, you're swimming upstream against legislation, against pop culture. The core idea of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the 70s was that worker power in general and union power in particular needed to be cut back. Let me quote Warren Buffett, the famous investor. And Warren Buffett said, there's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. He actually said that. So let's talk about power. What we really care about isn't the amount of power. I mean, how would you measure that anyhow? But the balance of power. It's not that the workers don't have enough. It's that the ratio between worker power and management power is out of balance, which means that to improve things, we need some combination of increasing the power of workers and decreasing the power of their employers. Now, the last time I worked in a factory was a summer student in the 70s, so I'm not exactly an expert in labor organizing, but I do have a couple of specific ideas that might be worth pursuing. The biggest and most visible group of workers are the people in the warehouses, and obviously organizing them would be of huge benefit and something that we should all be pursuing. But high-tech companies in general, and Amazon in particular, do have other clusters of people who are generally disempowered. For example, the people who work in the data centers, keeping all those thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of computers going. There are thousands and thousands of those people, and they are pretty hard to replace. And you can't just shut a data center down and move it somewhere else if there's a certification vote. There are call center staff. There are all the people doing mechanical Turk, gig economy type work. I would think there are opportunities in all those places. And also, there is people like me. There are people like me, people like Emily Cunningham and Marin Costa, who were fired from technology jobs because they spoke up at Amazon about the problems of the workers. If you actually survey these tech workers, they may be high paid, they may be super hyper over entitled people, but they tend to be politically progressive and actually friends of workers. And I think there are opportunities we have not yet encountered for trying to organize among them and turn them into activists, because they have the potential to realize that there is much to gain for the world and little for them to fear personally. So opportunities there. But instead of the particularities of labor organizing, on which I'm no expert, I want to focus on the excessive power of big companies in general, of big tech in particular, and Amazon in particular. So why is it hard to organize unions in America? In large part, it's because of anti-union legislation bought and paid for by lobbyists and campaign contributors who infest the seats of government and pour money into the pursuit of obtaining favorable legislation and regulation. Lots of political scientists and economists have looked on the return on investment of this sort of lobbying and contribution, and it's huge. Now, they've mostly focused on direct lobbying expenditures. And there's another thing they do. There's this huge flow of money to think tanks and ideologists and right-wing politicians who can be relied upon to argue that we cannot afford progressive labor laws or a Green New Deal or comprehensive public health insurance, or to force huge corporations to quit dodging taxes because that would ruin the economy. Now, those politicians are just wrong. There are lots of jurisdictions with progressive labor laws, aggressive carbon reduction programs, and generous public health social safety nets, and who are aggressive about going after corporate tax dodgers. You have a few of them in Europe, and their business sectors seem to be doing just fine. But these facts don't seem to matter very much in the land of the right-wing ideologists. The power of big business isn't bad just because of the influence it buys. It's bad because it leads to oligopolies and monopolies that reduce competition and stifle innovation. The number of sectors of our economy where customer choice has been reduced to an acceptably small number of vendors is large, and it's growing. Thus, one of the most powerful political programs we could get behind with the aim of correcting the power imbalances that concern us is anti-monopoly. For example, consider my former employer, Amazon. Why on earth should an online retailer, a cloud computing company, a smart speaker company, an organic supermarket company, and a video production company all be conglomerated into one corporate entity controlled by one person and owned by one set of shareholders? To start with, many have criticized Amazon.com for predatory pricing policies that squeeze small independent businesses along many different axes. So how has Amazon gotten away with this? Well, two reasons. First of all, for many years, Amazon has shown relatively little concern for being profitable. The only way this makes sense as a business strategy, if your goal is to achieve monopoly power so that after you've squashed the competition, then you can raise the prices and rake in the big bucks. But in recent years, Amazon has been profitable. And a large part of that is due to the cash generated where I used to work in the cloud computing business. So in effect, cloud computing is providing the resources that Amazon is using to crush whole sectors of the retail economy. In what sane universe could this possibly be a good idea? Let's zero in even further and look at that retail arm, Amazon.com. It's a business that at the most basic level is easy to understand. They sell goods to people, things that they buy and sell at a markup, or goods from other people on which they take a cut of the sale. Sounds straightforward enough, except for there is a continuous rumble of complaints from merchants that Amazon is one way or another using its status as both owner and participant in the marketplace to put its thumb on the scales one way or another. This is one of the reasons why last March, Elizabeth Warren proposed introducing the notion of a platform utility to rein in Amazon's behavior and monopolistic power. But at the end of the day, isn't Amazon.com a good thing? Amazon talks about customer obsession, and they're not kidding. Who could be against a huge selection of products, decent prices, and fast delivery? Hey, those are all good things. But at what cost? It's not free. The goodness is not free, and right now, the downside of this goodness, the cost is being paid by the warehouse workers. And why is that? Well, pardon me for being boring, because once again, it's an imbalance of power. When the big picture of arithmetic of who benefits and who doesn't is worked out, the experienced people without power gets assigned a value of 0 in that arithmetic. It does not show up in the calculation. But hey, I don't want to beat up on Amazon too much because I don't think Amazon is the problem. I think Amazon is a symptom of the problem. Let's pick another example. Another company I used to work for, Google. Why on earth should a web search provider, a web search advertising company, a cloud computing company, a video production company, an office services company, and a mapping geolocation company all be smushed together? In the case of Google, almost all the money is flowing out of the web search advertising business and being used to cross-subsidize those other businesses. And I'm not going to claim that Microsoft, Apple, or Facebook are really any better. Speaking of poor worker experiences, let me take a quick side trip from warehouses into another sector where working conditions are lousy and unemployment is rife. I'm talking about journalism. In the last couple of decades, we've seen the business of advertising-supported publication pretty well collapse. with the effect that our intellectual landscape has been impoverished and the availability of high quality reporting to ordinary people has been sharply diminished. This is a direct consequence of the monopolization of the advertising market by Facebook and Google, who currently control more than 70% of all internet referral traffic. How can we hope for progress with this sort of monopoly control, not only of the means of production, but the means of communication? It just doesn't make any sense. So there are a few things that most sane, reasonably progressive people can agree that we want to see in society. We want aggressive action to stave off the worst effects of the climate crisis. We want to see less egregious inequality with a gilded class of the moneyed and the homeless in the streets of every great city. We want a more human relationship between the people who sell goods and services and the people who buy them. And most of all, we want a more human relationship between the people who employ people and the people who are employed. My belief is that we're not going to make much progress on any of these fronts unless we seriously attack the power imbalances that characterize 21st century capitalism. In particular, we're not going to reduce the risk of death by coronavirus in the warehouses of the world. Inequality, current gross inequality of wealth and power in the world has increasingly troubled more and more people. But with the advent of COVID-19, it is possible for the poor and disempowered to receive the death penalty by the virus by being sent out to work on the front lines while the managers stay at home in their country places. So there are two paths forward. First, organically increase the power of the workers from the bottom up through activism and organizing. Second, use conventional, old-fashioned, boring politics to systematically reduce the concentration of power and wealth that is infesting and poisoning the fabric of our society. I see no reason not to take both paths, and I'd like to find a way to help. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to being part of the rest of this discussion.
Tim, thank you very much. And thank you for the stand you've taken. It's important. I believe that you're available for some questions and answers. Is that correct?
Absolutely, be delighted.
Terrific. Why don't we open this up? Does anyone have any questions for Tim? If you do, why don't you raise your hand virtually?
I see a few questions already there in the comments. Hold on a moment.
Yes.
Let me see. So Tim, am I correct? This is from Steve Garlick. Am I correct that Amazon create matching products based on their analysis of how well a product moves to compete? This takes work away from other businesses and damages pricing, meaning workers are paid less. That's absolute. Well, I have no firsthand knowledge of this, but it has been frequently alleged, including in publications like the Wall Street Journal that are not exactly progressive and worker oriented. And it was precisely for this reason that Elizabeth Warren proposed a legislative framework where those who operate this kind of large-scale marketplace are not allowed to also be participants in it and offer products on it, which seems like the most basic common sense to me. And of course, one of the consequences of this is people who get paid less. A question this is from Jonathan Miller. A question I have as a software engineer. Do you think AWS, IBM, Alibaba Cloud, Azure can be reformed, or do new companies need to be created? And what are the challenges of that? Projects like Project Gaia in the EU. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with having companies like operations like AWS and Azure and the others you mentioned. I think it's a big problem if they are being used to cross-subsidize Amazon, the Amazon retail market. And I think we do need aggressive antitrust prosecution to pry these operations apart. Azure does not need to be part of Microsoft. Google Cloud does not need to be part of Google, and AWS certainly doesn't need to be part of Amazon. It's to be brutally honest, it's going to be very difficult to mount competition against the big three, because to do this, you have to invest billions and billions of dollars to buy the hundreds of thousands of computers that you need to operate such a thing. So I'm perhaps a little less optimistic on that, but at the very least, they need to be pried apart. This one is from Kimberly Keller. Tim, do you know anything about the Amazon Union Avoidance Program? Is it an in-house operation? Are there staff who work for Amazon who develop and carry out union avoidance activities? Well, no, I don't know, to be honest. But the story of I'm sure there are many people on this call who could tell the stories about how violently and quickly Amazon responds to any attempt to unionize. And, you know, on the occasions when there have been, you know, successful certification votes, for example, in call centers, well, that call center gets shut down the next day. So I don't know if there is such an organized group inside Amazon, but it wouldn't be terribly surprising if there were. So those are the questions that were in the chat. Be happy to hear from anybody else.
And you're welcome to ask your question if you don't want to type it.
Yes, just unmute yourself and speak up if you feel like it. Oh, I see two raised hands. Giuseppe Chillis, go ahead. Here, I'll unmute you. I can't. You have to unmute yourself. Or maybe Colin has to unmute you. Oh, John Logan. Okay, did Tim come across any concrete actions that Amazon or Google took, internal or external experts, spyware, lobbying, to stop tech worker organizing? No, sorry, I don't have firsthand knowledge of that. But as I said, you know, the actions of Amazon certainly support the hypothesis that that sort of thing is going on.
Hi, Tim. Ian Gold from the Teamsters. Could you speak a little bit about how AWS operates within Amazon? Were you completely separate and only working on AWS? Just how the business units interrelate.
Yeah, Amazon is unique in that it's very, very loosely organized. You know, a manager or an engineer in AWS could go from year to year without talking to anybody who worked remotely in the warehouses. Similarly, the warehouse people would rarely talk to AWS people. Similarly with Alexa, similarly with Amazon Prime Video. These are very, very highly independent things. I was unusually lucky in that I had some interaction with engineers on the warehouse side and had a little bit of a view into it, more than most people would. But generally speaking, no, they are separate tribes and do not really interrelate very much.
And then how much, just as a follow-up, how much of AWS supports, I take it there's a significant support for the different business operations of Amazon and then outside businesses, is that correct?
Yeah, so Amazon.com is a big customer of AWS, but then so is Intuit and Nike and, you know, Capital One Bank and many, many other things, Netflix, et cetera, et cetera. But I actually I was doing a little work on this, and between the first quarter of 2018 and today, I'm just going to read you off the percentage of all Amazon profits that come from AWS. So 73%, 63%, 61%, 65%, 50%, 73%, 85%, 64%. And in the most recent Q1 of 2020, 91% of Amazon profits came from AWS. So this business is being used to subsidize the retail operations that are being run at what more or less is break even.
Douglas,
Yes.
Kevin Harper Mendelucci has a question.
Hi, Tim. I continue in Spanish language. Hola, Tim.
Hi, Tim. And I was very happy to hear you today. I do have a question, though. You have a very broad vision of what the company is. What future awaits us, those who work for Apple? How do you see the future?
I don't have that much Spanish. I think I understood, but could maybe the translator?
Was Tim not on the correct channel? The question was basically, what does the future hold for people who work in
I'm
Apple?
going to ask if you could repeat your question and if the translator
I'm
can
working.
interpret,
Can you not hear me? Christy, can you hear me? It's Phil. Can you hear me, Christy? Put your thumbs up.
I can hear you, but I think the issue is that everybody has to choose a
Well,
language.
I can tell you what the question was. The question was basically,
Yeah.
what does the future, you can repeat it if you like. The question was, what does the future hold for those of us who work in Amazon? You, Tim, have a
Should
very
we
broad
try
view.
again?
Could you tell us?
I saw a translator on the Zoom call.
Okay.
So
The interpreter's
The
here.
English translation did
Can you
not
hear me?
come
Stuart, Stuart, can you hear me? This is Phil. Can you hear me? I'll say the question again. Hi, Tim. Can you, I'm very happy to see you. Can you hear me, Tim?
Let us wait to see what's going on with
You
the
have to choose
translation. Christy, are
interpreter
you
at the
getting the
bottom.
English translation or are you listening in Spanish?
the translation is working. They need to pick their language at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, this is the English interpreter. I'll
You
just
need to
speak
go onto
while
the
you're looking
English
for the
channel.
channel. It's at the bottom of the
Go
screen. It's
onto
the little
English
globe,
channel.
and just go on to
Yeah,
English. The number of
interpretation, and
languages.
choose English.
It's
Can you
the
hear the English
top.
interpretation?
Check on English at the top of that list there. It's the
Yes,
top.
yes, I did.
Can you have you got me now,
People
Tim?
keep
Can you hear me?
texting me to pick my language. I have. But
Okay,
it's still,
so
Can you hear me now, Tim?
yeah, I can hear the translator now. Please.
Excellent. Yeah, yeah. Okay, if you can tell to speak. Okay, fine. Yes, as I was saying, can you hear me now, Tim?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Really great to hear from you. I work for Amazon. I'm in Spain. And what I would like to know is this. What do you see as the future? You've got a very broad view of what Amazon is. What future awaits us, those of us who work for Amazon? How do you see that future, given the fact that globalization is advancing at the moment? So what do you think might happen with the company? Might we see the company going the same way as the automotive industry, which has got nothing to do now with the type of car-making factories we saw in the 1950s? And we're seeing things such as Pegasus and projects like that at the moment. And these are moving towards using robots in warehouses. How do you see the future? Please, Tim.
So I think we have to acknowledge that Amazon has been a very successful company, and apparently the people who are running it are quite smart. So I expect that if nothing is done, Amazon will continue to grow and to profit and to treat its workers very badly. So I think the future for Amazon workers is not very bright unless there is some combination of labor organizing and political legislation to address the problem. Now, I know that the people who run the Amazon warehouses would be very happy to replace the workers with robots. Whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing is open for discussion, but it has proved to be very difficult. They have been trying to do this for 20 years now, but for reasons we don't understand, it turns out to be very difficult to get millions of products in the door, put them on shelves, take them off shelves and put them on trucks and get them out to all the customers with robots. It's a very difficult, and there has been very little progress. So whereas in theory, one would expect to see the replacement of people by robots, in practice, it doesn't seem to be happening very fast.
thank you. Jenny Grensman, I believe, has a question.
Yes, her question is, Amazon is establishing a warehouse in Sweden. We as unions are about to act. How would you act to try and make them join an employers organization and bargain with us? Well,
this is sorry, Tim, may I just add something to my question? First, thanks for being here. It's very interesting. They already have AWS in Sweden.
yes.
Yes, and they are establishing this warehouse, and we think it's no news to them that Sweden has very strong unions that are very well respected in our societal model. What do you think we could do? How would you proceed as a union if you saw this happening?
Well, first off, I'm a computer programmer. I'm not an expert in labor organization, but it's wonderful that you have strong labor laws. And I think it would be absolutely fantastic if you could win win representation of the workers there and force Amazon to negotiate with you, because it would teach the world that it's perfectly possible to have unions and still have online shopping that works well. And also, I think that you should also try to organize aggressively in the AWS data center there, because there are a lot of people there who, frankly, are not treated very well and could really use some representation. And I think that Amazon has the habit of, when a union is approaching them, they run away. They close and they go somewhere else. And for the case of the data center, it's not possible to do that. It's full of very expensive computers that are all being used by customers to run very important programs. The idea of shutting it down and moving it is simply not possible. It's a crazy idea. They would never even think about it. So I would think that the chance of getting organized among the data center workers is probably also quite a reasonable thing to think about. So I really don't have any specific advice, but really good luck.
Thank you. I believe John Logan also wishes to speak.
Okay. John, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, you can think I'd be used to this by now. Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it very much. Just very quickly, I wanted to ask you about the sort of wave of activism we've seen amongst tech workers, not just at Amazon, but at Google, at Facebook recently over the Donald Trump tweets, and over issues like environmental justice, racial and gender equity, over cooperation with immigration and law enforcement services, and now, as you said, over people concerned about conditions within the warehouses. Do you think amongst the white-collar tech workers at Amazon or the other companies is unionizing a viable option? I mean, do they really think of themselves as the kinds of workers who would join unions, even although they may be progressive on these issues?
So it's clearly the case that on balance, these people are progressive. I had a very interesting conversation with US Congresswoman Jayapal, who represents the center of Seattle, where Amazon is. And her relationship with Amazon leadership is not very good because she keeps bringing progressive clauses, and Amazon has a policy of strongly denying that there are any problems. Having said that, she is elected. Now, if you look at that district, it's full of tech workers, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and so on and so forth. She is reelected very easily at every election. She gets lots of money from them. It is well known that in America, the areas where the tech workers are clustered are progressive. All the money goes to the Democratic Party, et cetera, things like that. So I think that the potential for the tech workforce to become a force for an activist force for progressive causes is very high. And it's starting to happen a little bit. I mean, I'm an example. The people who quit for Facebook are an example. The people who organized at Google to stop the misuse of machine learning are an example. And the people who organized at Amazon for climate issues, Amazon changed its direction and suddenly became a reasonably progressive company about climate issues. So the potential is there is very high. As to whether a union is the best vehicle for organizing them, I don't really have an opinion. I don't know. I think that it would perhaps need to be a slightly different kind of a union, because hourly pay is not really the key issue. These people, we're all making enough in that business. I assure you. But there are certainly some sectors of the tech workforce that are in their own way oppressed. And one good, strong example is the gaming companies, the people who make all the computer games that we all play. They are treated incredibly badly. Yeah, they get okay pay, but they are required to work 70 hours a week, 9 months at a time. And there is no space for humanity There was this famous thing going on in China. The guy who started Alibaba, Jack Ma, had the 996, which meant you should work from 9 to 9, 6 days a week policy. So there are some areas where there is real oppression, but on balance, these are people who are pretty empowered, and maybe another vehicle for activism, a caucus or a league or something like that, would be more appropriate. But it's certainly worth investigating. From Aaron Brenner, we have a question. Can you talk about the relationship between AWS and developers, particularly using open source? We have heard complaints that AWS looks to see which software is selling well and copies and sells it. Yeah, this is a very difficult and complex issue. AWS has a big expertise, not in so much in writing software, but in operating software, keeping the computers running them, keeping them on the air. And sometimes AWS is better at operating the open source software than the people who wrote the software, because writing software and operating software are two different skills. I'm not sure what the correct outcome of this is, but once again, the problem is exacerbated by the fact that AWS is such an insanely profitable business that they are able to throw huge amounts of money at the problem. And it's another example of the imbalance of power between AWS and the economy at large. So from Michael Zucker, we have, Tim, thank you for sharing with us. Would you share with us what you think are the key imperative or imperatives are of the company going forward, what they must do to execute their plan, and what challenges they face on execution? I assume you're talking about Amazon. Well, Amazon is suffering from the law of big numbers. You can grow 20% a year when you are a small company, but when you are the world's biggest, most highly valued company with 1 million employees, it becomes very, very difficult to keep growing. And Amazon's whole premise has been, well, don't worry about profits, just worry about the growth. Well, profits will come later. And now it's simply mathematically impossible for Amazon to keep growing at this rate for too much longer. So if they're going to be considered a successful business, that's going to have to be based on making profits, which means they're going to have to do some combination of raising prices and reducing costs. And of course, the most popular way for a capitalistic company to reduce costs is to take it out of the workers by reducing wages. So I suspect that Amazon is going to have to do something that is going to be politically unpopular and put them in a position where they are more open to aggressive organizing, to aggressive political activism, and so on. So I think that we are approaching the time when it's really the best time to try and reduce the power of Amazon and their capability to throw their weight around the way they have. What else do we have here? Sorry, there. Okay, I would like to ask something. This is Julian Andres Marval, Arrieux. I would like to ask something. Is it feasible in the near future that the investors could pressure executives to better working conditions overall, but more specific regarding health and safety? It certainly is. Last year in the 2019 employee meeting, shareholders meeting, there was a resolution that Amazon should become much more activist on climate change and the climate emergency. And it was recommended for passage by the Shareholders Advisory Committee. It did not pass. It came to 40% of the vote or 30% of the vote or something like that. But within a few months, Amazon changed its direction and decided to become a much better citizen on the global climate stuff. So that's evidence that shareholder pressure can accomplish good things. And I think that now is a good time to consider that kind of organization among shareholders, simply because of the COVID crisis. And it's not a matter of just inequality, it's a matter of people dying. And this is clearly unacceptable in civilized societies. And I think that it's perfectly possible that shareholders could be motivated to request Amazon, to demand that Amazon become a better citizen of the world.
There's a wonderful question here from Massimo Menzi from Italy. Among the Amazon management, how many Tim Brays could we find?
Now, let's be fair. The move that I took was difficult, but it was much less difficult for me than it would be for a lot of other people. I am over 60. I am financially secure. I've been in high tech for 40 years. I've made good money. So it was much less painful for me than it would be for others. Here is part of the problem: is if you are a technologist, working for Amazon is great fun. It's a great job. It's technologically very interesting. The customers are very interesting. There is a famous quotation saying, it is very hard for a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. And as a result of that, it's very easy for a technologist not to understand the unfairness and insanity that is happening in the warehouses, because if they understood it, then they could not be comfortable having their very rewarding financially and intellectually job. Having said that, the number of people who were doing the kind of thing I did and the kind of thing that Google and Facebook and so on did 2 years ago was zero, more or less. And now it's not zero. So potentially there are a lot of people out there. I have received a certain number of private communications saying, Tim, I sympathize with what you did. And actually, that's interesting. I should point that out. So when I quit, I had no idea that this would become a news story. I thought, oh, well, maybe there'll be discussion on the computer programmer forums about this. So I woke up on the morning after I quit, and it was on all the TV stations and all the newspapers and so on. And I got literally thousands and thousands of reactions by email, by Twitter, by LinkedIn, by various other channels and so on. And of the reactions that I got, 99+% were friendly and supportive. So clearly, there is a reasonably broad base of sympathy out there for people who want to take action. And I think it's easy to understand why. I think that there is an increasingly broad perception that Amazon is too powerful, Google is too powerful, the internet companies are too powerful, the banks are too powerful, the leading players in the economy are simply too powerful, and there's a lot of sympathy for anybody who wants to struggle against them. So yeah, I think that there are a lot more people like me waiting to be pushed. We have a question from John Logan here. Do Amazon's algorithmic management and HR practices, firing low-performing warehouse workers, denying sick leave, make it vulnerable to criticism? Oh my God, yes, of course. There have been some pretty good books written about what it's like to work at Amazon, and I think I hope that as a result of the big news story about me leaving and so on, I hope that maybe it is less acceptable for Amazon to fire whistleblowers. So I hope that more people will come forward and tell the truth, tell the story about what's actually happening in the Amazon warehouses, because the arrival of COVID-19 has shone a very harsh light on the practical real world results of the difference in wealth and power between the huge companies like Amazon and the working people. But yeah, I want to hear more of those stories. Here we have.
We also.
Go ahead, please.
No, we also have a question from Christy.
Hi,
Christy.
Tim, thanks. I just want to thank you again for coming and joining us at this meeting. It's so much of what you say is inspirational and motivational for all of us. So it's really special, not only that you've joined us for the meeting, but that you spoke out against Amazon when they retaliated, sort of crossing that line. But having someone on the inside speak out is such a positive thing for us, for the workers, but also for the world in general, about humanity and doing the right thing. I have a question about Europe, and that's because we have so many Europeans in the meeting, and traditionally European law is much more favorable. It's more common. In fact, it's the norm in most places that workers have collective agreements and social dialogue and a relationship with the employer. And it's obviously been really hard to achieve that outside of the US as well, except where it's really legally required. But my question is just, how does Amazon see its strategy for Europe? And is it just kind of an appendage and a minor piece of its work, or is it something they see as critical for the expansion of Amazon? I just don't know if there's a European strategy, and if you could comment on that. Thanks.
Right. I can't comment on the strategy of the retail side because, I was not close to that business leadership. Having said that, the aggregate economic power of the European nations is larger than the United States. And so it's not a market that any sane company that wants to grow can afford to ignore. I know that AWS, where I worked, I joined in 2014, and at that time, they had one European data center, which was in Dublin. And since I joined, they opened data centers in Frankfurt and London and Paris and Sweden. And I believe there's one been announced in Italy and in Milan, although it has not been opened. And those are huge investments. The amount of money it takes to actually open an AWS data center is insanely huge. So I think all the evidence would suggest that AWS is making a pretty strong bet on Europe. Also, where are you going to expand if you don't expand in Europe? Japan, Amazon's doing quite well in Japan and Korea. China is the obvious other candidate, but it's very, very difficult to operate in China if you're not a Chinese company. So frankly, they don't really have any choice. If they want to expand, they have to expand in Europe. And I'm super optimistic that some of the European companies with their strongly superior labor laws can prove that Amazon can operate in the presence of unions. I mean, the experience in France, I think, was very instructive to all of us. Amazon said, okay, well, we're just not going to talk to the unions. And in France, in the period of COVID, the unions took them. By the way, if there's anybody on the call who was part of that, congratulations, that was fantastic work. Took Amazon to court and won. And Amazon was incredibly childish. They said, oh, you said we can ship only essentials. Well, we're just going to shut down. It's like a boy on a playground saying, I'm going to take my ball and go home because you're not playing my rules. And so Amazon appealed and lost in the court. And then finally they said, okay, we got to talk. And they talked. And it proved, by God, it proved for everybody in the world can see that if you force Amazon to deal with unions, they will deal with unions and the business will not stop. So congratulations on that. We need more stories like that.
Thank you. We have a question from Holly Feldman Winship. Can you speak to Amazon's plans in further developing its own delivery services?
Yeah, that's a very contentious issue. So in 2018, I think it was, Amazon announced next day delivery, which was a very, very ambitious goal. And it turned out to be completely impossible to meet using Amazon's own, delivery infrastructure. So they ended up cutting a bunch of hasty deals with every delivery company they could find, including some who were not second rate, not fourth rate, but 10th rate. And there were all these horrible stories about, the drivers having to urinate in bottles because they didn't have time to stop, and terrible traffic accidents where they killed people in the streets because they didn't have time to sleep and so on. It was a disastrous experience for Amazon. There was a huge story on it, and I think the Washington Post about how bad this experience was. So Amazon very much wants to control its own destiny, and it doesn't like being dependent on companies like Fedex and UPS and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it's not cheap at all to create a world-scale delivery service. So this is one of the big pain points for Amazon, and I would hope that it is an opening for labor organizations, because I think that Amazon is going to be forced to expand into having more and more of its own delivery infrastructure, whether we're talking about trucks, planes, everything. And there's a strong tradition, even in America, of truck drivers and that kind of worker being organized. So this strikes me as another pretty decent organization opportunity.
We have a question from my brother, Stan Gasik at the UFCW. Do you have any particular insights into Amazon's management philosophy and methodology in Whole Foods?
Right. So Amazon has when it buys a company, it it tries to force them to use Amazon technology, but is not too aggressive about forcing them to throw away their culture and become, 100% Amazon. So I believe that the culture of Whole Foods is still pretty distinctive and quite separate from the rest of Amazon. How that affects organizing opportunities and so on, I wouldn't know.
Patricia Nilsson asks, do you think your leaving has increased pressure inside Amazon, such as more vice presidents leaning on top management regarding workers' rights? Or is it now perhaps seen as more risky to speak out?
I know for a fact that, so I was a member of a community within Amazon called the Principal Engineers. This is a community of less than 1,000 or so of the most senior engineers inside Amazon, and they have a very strong internal community. I know for a fact that the principal engineer community has been speaking up and has expressed its discomfort in some respects with some of the things that Amazon does. Not 100%. A lot of these people are sort of married to the company and basically support all the actions of management. But other vice presidents, I don't know, to be honest. I think that the technology, the community of technology workers in general and engineers is growing more activist as time goes on. But I don't know the details, but I'm certainly continuing to speak up, and if we can convince these people to become activists in the world, that would be great.
Tim, can you speak to how much governments and big companies such as Volkswagen rely on AWS?
Yes. So I don't want to turn this into a commercial, but for most large organizations, there are quite considerable advantages in using cloud computing, which is to say that Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure or AWS. That there are a lot of good reasons to use those rather than own and operate your own computers. And I'm not going to take your time with talking about that. But AWS was growing at their public figures. AWS was growing at like 35-40% a year, just in terms of the amount of business. And that's a huge growth rate for a large company. It's already $40 billion annual revenue, and it's growing at 35-40% a year. And AWS is getting customers from every sector, from government, from every level of industry. I don't know about Volkswagen. I was actually talking to some people at Volkswagen about automotive automation standards. I don't know what their actual cloud computing posture is, but it's growing very, very fast. AWS is becoming a key component. If AWS goes down, if there's a big problem, so AWS doesn't run, the internet is completely broken. It's becoming a key component.
Good. Alfred Bajara from Poland would like to speak. Alfred?
Tak, dziękuję. Witam serdecznie.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everyone. I'd like to ask you the following question. Don't you think that COVID and the pandemics will continue to favor the increase in growth and the increase in profits of Amazon, and it will reach infinity? It is highly concerning, in my opinion. And my second question is about taxes. Amazon does not pay any taxes in Poland. I represent Solidarity in Poland. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself, but Amazon does not pay any taxes in Poland. We know that it doesn't pay taxes in Europe either. And I heard that they also avoid paying taxes in the US. What do you think? What kind of mechanisms do they use in order to avoid paying taxes? And why do politicians around the world allow for it? Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, I want to say that before I left Amazon, I was in communication with the warehouse workers from around the world, and some of the most passionate and loudest voices were coming from Poland. There were 3 women from Poland who were participating in all of the no, not just the 3 women, the ones I talked to, but there were many workers in Poland protesting very loudly and very eloquently, and I think they were among the most effective at representing the interests of the Amazon workers. And by the way, Amazon in America and some places in Europe pays actually not so bad compared to other warehouse jobs. It's not the worst job you can get. But in Poland, the rate of pay in the warehouses is terrible. So Amazon should be ashamed of itself at the pay levels in Poland. In terms of the capacity for growth, you know, if you grow by 20% every year, you will become infinitely large. That's not going to be possible. You know, Amazon already has 50% of all online shopping. It can't keep on growing at this rate. It's going to have to slow down. That's why Amazon is going to have to refocus its attention from growth to profit. And when it refocuses its attention to profit, that means that it will probably increase the exploitation of workers, which is terrible, but maybe an opportunity for the people on this call. The tax situation is very interesting. There are different situations. So for example, if you consider the example of Apple, Apple is an incredibly profitable company. They are throwing off billions and billions of profit every quarter. And they are dodging taxes by using very sleazy legal maneuvers. You know, they're giving all the tax to some company in Luxembourg that gives it to some company in Ireland that gives it to some company in Bermuda. And so the tax collector cannot find it. It's incredibly sleazy. And fortunately, several European organizations in the EU are fighting them over it and actually forced Amazon to pay a bunch of tax to Ireland that Ireland didn't even ask for. So that's progressive, and I highly support it. Now, in the case of Amazon, it's a little bit different. Amazon pays very little taxes because compared to the other companies, Amazon has very little profits. The profit margin of Amazon outside of AWS is astonishingly small. For many years, they have said, we are interested in growth. The profit will come later. Well, as you pointed out, you know, infinity is not possible, so the growth cannot go on forever. So at some point, they're going to have to turn their attention from growth to profit. And at that point, you know, the tax officials should pay very close attention and ensure that they pay the profit that pay the tax that they should. Also, as I mentioned, this is one of the bad effects of corporate concentration. The profit in Amazon is not very big, but the profit is coming mostly from AWS. So AWS should be an independent company that reports its profits and pays taxes on those profits. And this is another reason, I think, why activists should be working very hard to break up huge, powerful companies like Amazon.
Well spoken. We have another question from Steve Garelick from the GMB in Great Britain.
Sorry, just unmuting. 2 real quick questions, Tim. One relates to the fact I think Uber have their home on AWS servers and also play the shell game with regard to where they are and where they're based for avoidance of taxation. And along with Amazon, there is obviously maybe, as has been discussed, it's a US-based flaw that is very anti-union. But is there an alliance with the likes of Amazon, Uber, and some of the other large corporations to basically block out, find ways to obfuscate unions, fight against unions, or control against workers? And just on one other point, the warehouse workers in the UK may be paid okay, but I can assure you when I only have 1 mask for an entire shift, you know, or, you know, I've just got 5 cases of COVID on those sites within the London region I cover, I absolutely assure you it ain't great.
Right. As far as I know, there is no, you know, there's certainly no cross-company anti-union organization that they'll talk about, but then they wouldn't, would they? Uber, Uber has, Uber pretends to be a technology company. Uber is actually a labor arbitration company trying to convert employees into gig serfs, more or less. And Amazon is guilty of that to some extent too, because whereas the quality of treatment that Amazon employees, even in the warehouses, receive is quite a lot better than the quality of treatment that the gig economy, temporary staff. And I think that that's something that unions and progressive organizations should be focusing on a lot, is the whole gig economy and how deeply unfair and rotten that is. Now, I do know that there are companies that provide services specifically aimed at helping large companies fight against unions. There were some news stories about this, about how they rate individual workforces in individual warehouses, give them a number that says how likely these people are to unionize, and it's based on what the typical voting patterns are, political voting patterns are in the area, and the average income, and church attendance, and a bunch of other things like that. And that's hideous. That's awful and appalling. But what the effect of this is that Amazon, I'm quite sure that when large companies decide where they're going to put up new factories or new warehouses, they carefully select places that are hostile to unionization. And that's just a fact of life, and something that people in the labor movement are going to have to buckle down and fight against.
We have a number of reporters on this call today, at this meeting today, and I wanted to let the reporters ask their questions if they have any for Tim.
Hello, can I ask a question? I'm Isabel Hamilton from Business Insider.
Yes.
Hi, Tim. I'm Isabel. I've been covering Amazon extensively for a while now. I was wondering if you had any comment as well, because you made the comment on, we've talked earlier on this call about the intersecting crises that are going on at the minute with like COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement taking off. I was wondering if you had any comment on Amazon's announcement that it's suspending its sale of facial recognition software for 1 year. This comes after Amazon workers campaigned for the sale, for it to stop the sale. What do you think of this announcement? Do you think it signals a change in Amazon's approach to this, or is the 1 year time limit a bit telling?
As far as I know, this is the first time that Amazon has ever done something of this flavor, said that they are going to restrict the use of their product in any particular application domain or anything like that. So on that basis, I'm going to say that it is a significant occurrence, and one I'm pleased to see. I'm glad to see the big tech companies in general, and Amazon in particular, starting to think more carefully about the uses to which their products are put. I don't think the 1 year thing matters that much, pro or contra. I was a little puzzled why it was in there. Obviously any policy like this is open for reconsideration later. So they're putting a timestamp on when the reconsideration is going to happen. It's going to be another news story in a year. But nonetheless, it's a significant move.
Thank you. Is it all right if I ask a different question as follow-up, or is there anyone else in the side who would like to? Okay. So yeah, you've spoken about breaking up, prying apart different parts of the business. I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail. Are you in favor of breaking up, which elements would you split apart specifically? You've mentioned AWS in particular as something you would want as an independent company paying its own taxes and whatnot, but what other parts of the business would you want prized apart specifically?
Well, I'm not an antitrust expert, and I don't have that deep an insight into the internal economics of these things. But and I also want to say that I think this is true not just of Amazon, but of the big tech in general, and even more so of society in general. There are so many sectors, ranging from beer to agricultural chemicals and so on, that are dominated by an absurdly small number of vendors who have a strong incentive to collude. And so I think that it would be excellent for the world's economy if there were an aggressive attempt to break up the to break up the reigning huge high-power businesses. Now, I think big tech is a particularly egregious example of this. If you look at the big five, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Apple, and if you look at the goods and services that those companies provide to the world, I think that it's absurd that there's only 5 companies doing that. It should be 100 different companies doing that. And if that were to happen, the employees would come out better, the customers would come out better, the shareholders might even come out better. Monopoly is a pernicious force that is slows innovation, reduces worker satisfaction, reduces customer satisfaction, and is generally bad for society. Okay, now to get back to Amazon, I'm not an economist. It seems like obviously there's a good case for spinning AWS out. There's this new line of business that didn't even exist a few years ago with Alexa and the related smart speaker products. It's not obvious to me what that has to do with Amazon or AWS. There is Amazon Prime Video, which is growing very fast and very successful offering from Amazon. What does a TV channel, essentially, what does a TV production company have to do with online retail or with cloud computing or so on? So I would think that you could straightforwardly find multiple different ways to break up Amazon and the other large tech companies that would be beneficial to the economy and to the population.
Thank you. I'd like to hand over to any other reporters who would like to ask a question.
Anybody else?
Well, with that, thank you for the conversation and for having me here. It's been a treat, and the work that's being done here is fantastically important, and I could not possibly be more supportive.
Tim, we're the ones who want to thank you for the courageous action you took. It's going to make a difference, and it is making a difference. It was powerful when you stood up, and we want to thank you, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Before we let you go, though, I see we have another question from Josh Adelson from Bloomberg News. Josh, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. Given the reckoning over Black Lives Matter now in the United States, is that something that you think increases pressure on Amazon over warehouse conditions?
Not directly in any way that I can see. It's well known that the demographic in the warehouse workers includes a large number of people of color and demographic groups that are low paid, so I would expect there to be a significant overlap between the people who feel uncomfortable with and frightened by their treatment by police forces and those who work in Amazon warehouses. Having said that, no obvious effect on Amazon's business comes to mind.